Helen is the Managing Director of TMS Consulting and has extensive expertise in human and organisational dynamics, enhanced through a successful 25-year career in both the public and private sectors. Helen has significant experience as a consultant, advising a range of clients on areas such as organisational capability, business optimisation, leadership, workforce productivity and fatigue. She works extensively with state and federal government departments and is also an experienced consultant in infrastructure, oil, gas and resource sectors. TMS Consulting specialises in fatigue management strategies and regularly advises clients on roster design, fatigue management plans, fatigue monitoring and educational initiatives related to fatigue. Helen is currently providing executive oversight on a significant fatigue study being conducted in oil and gas industry in Queensland and has presented several papers on fatigue, roster cycles and the challenges businesses face in managing fatigue effectively. Helen will draw on her experience of what is happening in fatigue management based on first-hand consulting experience with a range of clients in relevant industries. Please help me welcome Helen to the stage.
Thanks, Colin, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. As Colin said, we have been working with clients in Queensland extensively in the oil and gas industry, and I'm actually going to show you for the first time, the results have been made public, the initial findings of the study that we have done on a major pipeline project in Queensland. So that's part of the presentation today. As well as that, I'd like to just draw on some observations that we've been making as we move around camps, sites, projects, working with clients to really understand what are the intrinsic motivators around changing behaviour, what are the things we really need to think about organisationally, and how do we actually get attention for fatigue. Tim's company is clearly doing an amazing job, but there are a lot of companies who are well behind that, who are still not understanding that fatigue is a real hazard and needs to be treated as such. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I will show you the results of the study. It's been a year-long study. We've had someone in the field for a year, and I'll go through the detail of that and what we've collected and what it's told us. And the interesting thing is our client was particularly surprised by even some of the workforce profile information that we were able to uncover in terms of the project. We were surprised, they were surprised, but it was obviously made the study a very useful thing for us to be doing. Talk a little bit about policy, roster design. There's been lots of really good information over the last couple of days, so I won't dwell on some of those if other speakers have covered them, but we will also talk about results on the ground. So combating apathy, making sure that employees are engaged, and what are those things we can do to actually change the culture, which is where we think clients will get the best bang for their buck. Anyone feel like this in the last month? So if you just think for a minute about your own fatigue levels, think about what you've been doing over the last month. Has there been times when you would say you were fatigued? The interesting thing we find in the field, and I'm sure many of you have this experience, people know when they're fatigued, they can tell you they're fatigued, but they'll still make choices that put them in harm's way. So how do we affect that? How do we make sure we don't end up in a situation where we're inadvertently encouraging people to take risks while they're fatigued? What does the research say? You've heard lots over the last couple of days, so I won't dwell, but just a couple of pertinent facts that get to roster length and length of day, which I'm going to cover when we get to the survey. In Germany, after reviewing 1.2 million occupational accidents in Germany, we found that the study found that the risk of accidents exponentially increased beyond the 8th and 9th hour of shift. How many people in the room work a 10-hour shift? All their employees do. How many of your employees work 12-hour shift? Okay, very common, more 12s than 10s. Anyone do longer than a 12-hour shift? A few. So it does vary, and the industries vary a great deal. But at the end of the day, after 8-9 hours on the job, fatigue is definitely starting to be an issue. Folcart and Lombardi also found there were exponential increases in risk over hours of duty. So even after 4 typical day shifts, the risk increased by about 17%. Who in the room is working a roster with their employees? vast majority of you probably. There's any number of types of rosters. There's 2 on, 2 off. We've seen 3 on, 3 off. 3 or 4 on and 2 off. There's any number of combinations. The one I'm going to look at with you today in terms of the study is the 28 days on and 9 days off. It's quite typical in the pipeline industry and used by some companies in the construction and gas industry. Other studies showed that jobs with overtime showed marked increases in injury hazard rates, up to 61%. Now, these are from all over the world. They may not be pertinent for you right now, but it's just an indication that we do get significant increase in risk. Tim's referral to the Sydney Morning Herald today, I think most of us, or a few of us anyway, had read that this morning going, yeah, we always knew it, now we're starting to really talk about it. It actually is worse than the impacts of alcohol. So what are the costs? You'll know all of these. Some examples up there of major projects that have been attributed to fatigue or human error. And to go back to the microsleep discussion, cognitive performance is one of the things that we know decreases significantly when people get fatigued. We'll show you what happened on our project when we did the study. So, the Exxon Valdez, other things, 3 Mile Line and Chernobyl even, have all had fatigue or human error attributed to what happened. In 2007, a study found that in Australia, 20% of motor vehicle accidents can be attributed to fatigue. So there's a lot of talk about it. We don't have to convince ourselves it's a problem. It's clearly going to potentially lead to some safety issues in the field. So where are the risks? Links do exist between fatigue and workplace accident. Would anyone disagree that they know that? Yeah, so we know it's there. It's hard to quantify though. Fatigue is a very subjective issue. It's not like giving someone an alcohol test first thing in the morning when they turn up to site. It's much harder to measure and it's much more behaviourally orientated. There's links between long hours, overtime and accidents. The effects of fatigue can be random and that's why studies are difficult to get a real-time, in the field view of what's happening. We think we've done the best that you can at that in terms of the project that we've done in Queensland, but it isn't, as Siobhan was talking about, it doesn't have the controls that a lab does. So we are looking at it much more from a, what did we learn about the workforce and the behavioural issues, but the data no doubt gives us lots of insight into whether there are actually fatigue and what levels and what does it look like over the span of the roster. So we'll get to that in a moment and have a look. Sleep deprivation or lack of sleep opportunity is one of the big issues that occur. How many people have employees that stay in camp regularly? Few. Depending on the industry you're in, it's quite common. Certainly the clients we work with have somewhere between 300 and 900 employees living on camp or in camp for extended periods of time. Typically they're 28 days on roster. So what does that do? There's a whole range of things around camp design that we need to think about. Soundproofing, light, air conditioning, all of those things become incredibly important in terms of managing people's sleep opportunity. So before I go any further, I've got an hour this morning, so I want to make this a fairly interactive session. I'd rather you did some talking than I did at all. So could I ask you to talk, either turn around if you're on your own there and talk to a couple of people, or talk to the person beside you. If you had to list the top 3 risks in your business that fatigue impacts on, what would they be? So just have a bit of a chat. Where are the key risk areas in your business as it relates to employees having levels of fatigue? So have a quick chat and I'll get a few shout outs. Turn around if you're on your own. Great. Done all right? Okay, I might stop you there. It's a quick discussion. We'll do this a couple of times this morning just to see what people's thoughts are. I'll repeat, so don't worry too much about volume. If you can just talk to me and then I'll repeat back to the crowd. So can I have some people nominate what were some of the key areas? One from you guys?
Yeah, just with relation to us, a long day, getting a call out to a fault, and then the technician maybe 300, 400, 500 kilometres away, at the end of a long day. The big risk for us is driving accidents.
Yeah, and potentially getting called out at the end of their shift, yeah? So they've already done 6 or 8 hours and then off they go to do another 4 or 6 to solve that problem. So on-call arrangements, all sorts of things around workforce design are issues there. Some other risks here?
Tasks at the end of a long shift.
Okay.
At the end of a blocker shift. Critical tasks.
Yeah. So if they're undertaking critical or technical tasks or things that have a safety component towards the end of the shift when we know they're going to be tired, particularly if they've been on a 12-hour shift, and you might not have mitigations or controls in during the shift. So definitely an issue. Over here.
The process was more in terms of the same safety aspect, so reduced alertness from the NRMA perspective, it shows drive long distances during the daytime.
Yep.
And also working alongside the road, the risk of fatality is actually quite high.
Yeah. Did anyone else have driving? Did anyone else talk about driving? Yeah, quite a few. We find certainly with our clients, and the study bears it out as well, that drive time is the highest risk area for the businesses we work with. On a typical pipeline project, for instance, they will drive somewhere between 3 and 5 million kilometres in the length of the project. And that's their highest risk area. Systems and technology get us so far, but driver behaviour is what we were talking about yesterday with one of the speakers. Someone up the back? Right at the back there? What do you guys talk about? Manual handling? Yeah. Cognitive performance, the decisions we make when we're tired, we would all know. We're not quite at our best when we're tired. It affects our decision making. Tim was also talking about this. So the cognitive performance, if it's decreasing, potentially we're making poor decisions about lifting, manual handling, those sorts of things, and mistakes happen. Just one more somewhere here at this table. Yep.
Flexibility in brake structures, so everyone's a bit different.
Yep.
Go earlier than later, but we've got that rigidity.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the traditional way of rostering, which we really need to reconsider, and I think the gentleman from New Zealand yesterday in his very smart uniform did a very good job of showing where if you really make a conscious choice, you can really work with your rosters. What we find with a lot of people, sounds like Biz Industries are really ahead of the game in terms of their approach, but what we're finding with a lot of clients is that this is the way we've always done it, this is what the guys want, so we'll continue to do it. So it is combating some of those beliefs and behaviours. Yep.
Can I just throw out static fatigue? We have a staff group that work night shift in an industry that doesn't compel them to do much more than basic supervision, so there's a lot of hours downtime spent in between security rounds and stuff like that. So, and then the capacity to have them do any form of meaningful task at 2 a.m. Other than we work in a prison environment, so
Yep.
They typically do a round every 2 or 3 hours thereabouts. And they sit down for a period of time, and so we find that fatigue stuff, what we call static fatigue.
Yep, absolutely. And the lack of adrenaline, the mental impacts of that, sitting doing nothing, no stimulation. They may not be doing heavy physical work, but they're obviously the fatigue will, if anything, might be in fact exponentially worse in those situations because the boredom and it's like nodding off in front of the TV. When there's not much to stimulate the brain, that's what happens. Most TV shows these days aren't very stimulating. So we talked a little bit about the risks. I'll go into this a little bit more later. You all know, I'm sure, what FRMS is about, and I don't need to lecture you on that. But I'm interested just in talking about how it intersects with your behavioural approach and how you're getting cultural change in your organisation. So for those of you who may not be familiar, a fatigue risk management system, or an FRMS, is a better way to manage fatigue as a legitimate hazard. And one of my key messages later in the discussion is that there are a lot of companies still around, and some of them we're working with clients now who are really getting their head around this. It's about roster length, or it's about individual choice, or it's an IR issue, when in fact it is a hazard. It's a real safety hazard and needs to be planned and mitigated accordingly. We have a long track record now of getting safety right. How do we embed and make sure our fatigue management, our FRMS, works within that safety management system? It relies on knowledge of sleep and safety science. Siobhan's presentation yesterday was excellent examples of the sorts of things we know about sleep and the impact on the brain. So what do we need to do in terms of changing our approach in the workplace? It is different to an SMS, not vastly though. In fact, we would say, and I'll show you a slide a little later, that your FRMS should sit within your SMS or your safety management system, but they both ultimately sit within your workplace culture, and that's the thing where you're really going to get change. So hazard controls, again, we've talked about these, I won't spend a lot of time, but Again, one of the key things is how you create sleep opportunity, particularly if you've got people remote. Now, not a lot of you had camp situations, so that means you've got people coming to and from their shift. What controls can you put in place or expectations? I've heard a lot over the last couple of days, people saying, well, we encourage the guys to do this, or we'd really like them to do that. The coming is a really strong discussion we need to have about what we can make compliance-based, what's expected as part of the role, what will we make you do as an employee in order to protect yourself and to protect our liability in terms of your fatigue, because there's growing and growing liability. Certainly in Queensland, the legislation now means that employers need to be much more end-to-end and focused on what they're doing around fatigue, even for their contractors. They're being liable, it's harmonised the workplace, so there's a whole bunch of liability that goes on over and above what you would typically expect for your company to be looking for. The detect and stop errors, some of you I'm sure would be very familiar with Drew Dawson, or Professor Drew Dawson. The work he and Christy McCulloch have done around how you stop a hazard progressing to an accident. If you're not aware of that model or that work, there's a paper on it at our stand. You're most welcome to take it, and in there we reference their work and talk about the model of how you stop a hazard or a risk moving through the control stages and actually becoming an accident. So it's worth having a think about what controls have you got in place in your organisation. I'm going to skip this one for a moment and come back. In terms of contributors to fatigue, again, we've talked a lot about them: workload, predictability of your roster, the type of work. One of the things we were looking at in the 28-9 roster is, do people adapt? Is there a level of adaptation that happens over a 28-day period, and therefore do they get more sleep, and is their fatigue actually decreasing, or are they able to even out? Notwithstanding the few people Siobhan identified who are great no matter what's happening, the majority of the people weren't in that situation, and we found that the adaptation actually wasn't there. So roster length, shift length, all of those sorts of things, hours in the day, and of course things other people have talked about, sleep, potential sleep-related disorders, your family life, the level of social isolation that you're experiencing as an employee impacts on your psychology, can also impact on your fatigue. Exercise, lifestyle, diet, all of those things that you've heard about. So they do impact, but they are sitting squarely within the individual choice arena. The clients we have who have staff in the field, certainly they try to make sure they serve healthy food. Tim was referring to that as well. The mess is very conscious in terms of the catering that's provided, but at the end of the day it's a buffet, and these guys are out in the field, they've got much else of interest in their day beyond their work. They eat a lot of food, and I'll show you what that impacted in terms of the workforce shortly. So we have safety management systems. Some of you, a lot of you, would have fatigue management policies. Some don't. It is a new area for some industries and some clients. We've got procedures, training, awareness, penalties, rewards. There's a lot of talk going on about how we affect behaviour, and we've been here for a long time, so there's a lot of stuff around. But what's missing, what we would say, and what our clients I think would agree, is that it's about engagement and behavioural adoption. So how do we actually influence the psychology of our employees in a way that will choose them to make a better choice? And I'm going to talk a little bit about tactics around that in a moment. So what are you doing to influence behaviour? Process and compliance will get us so far. Systems are incredibly important, but what's equally important is what we do in terms of influence and behaviour. Because that's what happens when people make bad behavioural choices. And I'm sure it made total sense to him at the time to rest his head on the guard like that. Now, you'd hope you wouldn't see that, but we do see equally silly things going on in the field. People are tired, they're making poor choices, they're not thinking about the risks that are involved. So, does length matter? The guys in the field tell me it does. In fact, they often make the point strongly, but if we think about rosters and what we're finding in the pipeline industry in particular, and this is why we were funded by the Australian Pipeline Industry Association to do the study, is that there is a perception in the workforce, in fact with the unions as well to some extent, that it's all about roster length. That a 28 days in a row is too long, and it's causing fatigue. which is why we set out to do the study, which I'll give you a bit more information about in a moment. So does length matter? Is it about the roster? A lot of studies around, many of them line up to suggest that fatigue kicks in at about the 8th day of a roster, give or take a few. The 8th and 9th hour of a day and the 8th day of a roster. Now, depending on your roster length, there's very few that are less than 8 days, I'd imagine. There's not many people working one on, one off. So there is fatigue existing in most of the rosters that are used in Australia. So if it kicks in around that, that was borne out by our study, and it's the work in South Australia, which is incredibly valuable. Drew Dawson, other people, a lot of the universities doing studies similar to what Siobhan was talking about are showing a consistent pattern in terms of around that 8th day. It's also about the amount of hours in the day, as I've said. As the days go up, the sleep decreases. Generally, that's what the research is telling us. So what do we need to do to look beyond that? Roster optimisation is an essential activity. Again, New Zealand Police, obviously, making some big inroads there. Some of the work other speakers have talked about. But in some industries still, we're doing the pretty stock standard roster we've done for a long time. That's the way the guys like it. That's the way we've always done it. It's best for productivity. All of those sort of comments happen. We really need people to rethink their roster and really analyse their business. But there is no silver bullet. You guys know that. That's why you're here probably, trying to pick up a few tips. It is about meeting your business requirements but making it as safe and as effective as possible. Having said that, has anyone heard of Malcolm Gladwell? I'll get you talking again. So Malcolm has written several books. He's considered to be a thought leader in the world. He's a prominent US author. He wrote books like The Tipping Point, and the one I'm referring to is called Blink. And what Blink is about is the human brain's capacity to make an instant decision, generally accurate, with very short time frames involved. So he tells a story about a prominent museum in the US who buys a statue, spends millions of dollars and lots of experts proving that it's genuine, pay $10 million for that statue, and 2 experts walked in after they had cleared the cheque and said, "What are you doing? It's fake." They had an instant reaction to the fact that it was fake, yet the museum had spent weeks and lots of money proving that it in fact was genuine. So it's a blink test. So could I ask you with your pen to write down a couple of blinks? What are 2 or 3 things in your business right now that would make a difference to fatigue levels? Just blink it. Don't worry about the research, the studies, everything you've heard the last 2 days. Just blink it. What are the 2 or 3 things that would make the most difference to decreasing fatigue in your organisation? Go. Your brain knows the answer. Just write it down. Instinctual response is usually the best one. Okay, let's just yell out a few. It's okay to take a break. Cultural, non-rational. Education. Reduce night shift. Manpower, as in resources, having additional resources to be able to give guys breaks and things.
Yeah, so also probably introducing a bed or a nap.
A bed or allowing naps in our workplaces, yeah. Consistent rostered hours, so giving guys an opportunity to adapt to what they do. A little bit like, again, although interesting yesterday, the police in New South Wales, in New Zealand were giving flexibility, but repetitive flexibility perhaps is a better way of thinking about it. Yep, what about some others? Okay, back to resources or more flexible arrangements where people can amend, yeah? Yep. Same?
Management buy-in.
Aha. Good one. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because the thing that influences the culture most is the way leaders and managers behave, and Tim talked about having passion at the top. It's seriously something we need to think about, because it is the thing that makes the biggest difference. So again, resources, yeah. Awareness, so getting people across fatigue.
Flexibility and
Resources, okay, so some common themes, couple up the back. Awareness and education, so it's coming back to training, yep.
Incentives for working longer hours reduction.
Incentives for working longer hours. So pay them less if they work longer. That's an interesting approach. I haven't had that one before. I don't think the guys are going to like that one. Although it would encourage them to stop working, wouldn't it? Yep, okay, one more perhaps out the back. Over here. Reviewing night shift, yeah. So night shift is tough. It's absolutely one of those things that is, you know, the rhythms are all out of whack. People find it difficult to manage. So all of those things are very relevant. There's some common themes going through there. Usually the simplest answer is the right one. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. So let me just change tack slightly and talk about the study. So the Australian Pipeline Industry Association engaged TMS. We're very fortunate to have the opportunity to do a year-long study in the field. A member organisation volunteered themselves to be the guinea pigs, if you like, which was a big call on their part, because once the genie's out of the bottle, you need to know what you want to do with it. So this was a big call for the organisation. I'm not going to name names today because the official report has not yet been released, but I am going to give you the early data that's coming through in terms of the workforce and the cognitive performance. So I won't name names at this stage, but it is a large LNG project in Queensland, and we had the opportunity to be in the field for 12 months to measure fatigue. It was jointly funded by APIA and ourselves. It was in a 28 9-day roster environment. No night shift though, and that's an interesting thing in the pipeline industry. We don't work night shift. So it's important to keep that in mind. Some of you will, and the issues are slightly different, obviously. We had 12 months. We had a field researcher based in camp, himself on a 28 9-day roster. So I had to be conscious of monitoring his fatigue while he was monitoring everyone else's fatigue. The results will be published in December, but I'm going to give you the initial results today. What did we do? We did 7 28-day cycles, so 180 days worth of data. 347 participants over the life of that period who engaged with us in a variety of ways to manage their fatigue. There were daily surveys of employees. We used the actigraphs, which people referred to yesterday, or the acti watches as Siobhan called them. They are very much like a watch. There's a picture there of them. We have 1,900 nights of data in terms of what people were doing with their sleep. The reaction time testing, twice a day, beginning and end of shift. So for 28 days, the guys would come in every day and do a test at the beginning and a test at the end. And we're really trying ultimately to track what fatigue and cognitive performance was doing over the period of the 28 days. We also did one-off detailed surveys, about 12,000 responses to surveys, so we think the numbers stack up pretty well in terms of having a sample size, and that looked at demographics, sleep-wake history, their work history and health and safety information. In an ideal sense, what we want to do with the reports is map the fatigue-related results that we got with the safety-related incidents that the companies are having. I don't know about in your organisations, but interestingly what we found is that the one piece of information that's often missing off the safety report is the date, shock horror, or the day and cycle. So we're still looking at a way to reconcile that so we can map the cognitive performance to whether we're getting a drastic spike of incidents. Who were they? We looked at 25% were management, about 20% in trades, 34% in labour. Drivers were a key group for us to try and survey. They're a little harder. They move around a lot from camp to camp in this particular project, and then operators were about 11%. Interestingly, some of the biggest issues rest with management and administration. They are the people who will get up at 4:30 with the guys, see them off, work a full day, they come back, they go and have something to eat, then they go back into the office and they work till 10 p.m. When asked about that, well, I've got nothing else to do. I might as well work. Got too much on, need to get it done, and they're working incredibly long days. This was really interesting and a surprise to the client involved, so the company that allowed us to do this in their project. They were surprised that the work experience was so low for their workforce. Be interesting if you thought about your own organisations with what's happening in industries and spikes in the mining and resource sector, for instance, what's going on around labour. On average, or the average of the 350 odd people that we surveyed, 2 years or less was the average time in the industry. Now, up until that point, there was a real perception that this workforce has done this for 20 years, they all know the risks, they know how to work a roster, they love the 28 and 9, they've done this forever, it's written into their marriage contracts that they can't work less than a 28-day roster. So there was a real perception and culture around the fact that this was what the guys were used to doing and that it was something they were quite comfortable with. When in fact, the vast majority of them were working in the industry for less than 2 years, and the absolute biggest group were less than 1 year. So lots of new employees not used to the environment. The age categories just shows you again in percentages. The average age of the participants was 35. Again, the perception was they had an older workforce, when in fact the numbers are skewed much younger. And if any of you have got teenage children or work with young people in your organisation, I won't be boring and talk about Gen Y, but their approach to work, their perception of what they should be able to access when they're away from home, the way they conduct themselves in the workplace is very, very different to what we've been used to in previous generations. So is your company thinking about that, and what are you doing in relation to influencing those people and working with them in a way that makes sense to them? One of the big debates in camp is, do we shut off internet access at 9 p.m? Because there's all these distractions in camp that mean their sleep opportunity is reduced. Well, there's not much point really. They've got iPhones, they've got mobile Telstra sticks, they've got all the whiz-bang gear they need. They don't actually go to the internet cafe anymore. That's kind of us older guys who tended to do that. What about their weight? Weight is a key determinant in people's risk factors for sleep apnea or for getting poor levels of sleep, less oxygen at night, those sorts of things. There'll be other people in the room much more expert in that area than us, but this is what we found in terms of body mass index. The blue is the pipeline industry and the red is the national averages of the population. So much less normal weighted people, if that's a term. Many more overweight and many more obese than the normal population. So they are working long shifts for 28 days in a row. They're also overweight. Now, people will debate BMI as a way to measure that. In the final report, we'll also have waist circumference, which is an important thing to have a look at. So you're getting the very preliminary results here, very early looking at it, and to obviously do it in this format, we've gone with averages and aggregated the data quite high. In the final report, which eventually will be published publicly, certainly to members, but it'll be available more broadly, that will happen in the new year, and you'll be able to see this data at a much more granular level. But in essence, they're overweight. They're not sleeping as well probably, and their body's not coping with the work rosters and things that they were doing as well. When we asked people, do you believe there are unsafe levels of fatigue on this project or in pipelining generally, the vast majority said yes. Interestingly though, when asked to measure their own fatigue, they said, no, I'm fine, pretty much. Yeah? Which again is a behavioural characteristic I think you'd find would be quite common. The workforce is fatigued, but I'm fine. Yeah? Sleep, how are they sleeping? So again, we had the actigraph watches on the guys for length of cycle. I can't give you the R&R data, but in the final report, we did have a group, core group, who agreed to wear their actigraphs in their R&R period. It wasn't easy, I have to say, going out, getting guys in their steel caps and their high vis to do all this fancy stuff, but we did manage to get quite a few people. We did offer a couple of iPads at one point to say, come on, there's an opportunity to win an iPad if you contribute to the study. But in the end, it was actually quite good. The guys started to realise what we were trying to achieve, and they pitched in voluntarily to help. So in the final report, we will be able to compare camp sleep to R&R. So sleep per night. So the red is the time in bed and the blue is the total sleep time. When I present this in the field, I'm often known to say, I don't want to know what you're doing in that gap in between. Please don't tell me. But the point is they're going to bed, they're doing something else before they fall asleep. The combined results at the end, drivers and operators, office and the field. So all below in terms of the timing is about 6.5 hours roughly. The highest risk area are drivers, which is interesting what we said before about one of the highest risk areas is drive time, and it's actually the drivers who are getting less sleep. So The pipeline industry is middling out at about 6.5 hours, which is a little tiny bit more than mining, not significant, a bit more than transport, less than rail, and much less than the general public. Now, these figures are just based on published research that's available. We've not done those studies, but we're able to compare what other people are saying. So for pipelining in particular, I'm sure there's not anyone in the pipeline industry in the room. No, not a single one. But what we've been talking to aviation, we've been talking to construction companies, anyone who's running a roster-based arrangement, and we are getting information that will transfer over and assist those industries as well. But the important thing is they're getting much less than they potentially need. This is the sleep across the roster. Now, I have to stress with these next few slides, the data is still being cleansed. The statisticians have not done their work yet. Before the report's published, it will have academic validation and be reviewed. So I'm giving you, in essence, what we would consider to be the raw data. So just keep that in mind, but we don't expect there'll be a great change once it's refined. And this is what sleep across the roster looks like. Fairly minimal change. There is a bit of a kick up at the end, which we're surprised about and we think will actually diminish once the data has been properly cleansed. For some reason, at the last 2 days of the roster, there's a bit of a difference in behaviour. Anyone want to have a guess why? They're excited about going home. Yeah. They're tired. They might be getting more sleep because they're tired, potentially. What we found is that when you look at the roster, the first 2 to 3 days and the last 2 to 3 days are the highest risk time. Why would the first few days be the highest risk time? Adjusting to being on cycle, yeah, they haven't got their head in the game yet. They're not quite got their full attention on their work. So what you do with people when they first come in to camp or first get back onto a roster after they've had a break, it's really worth carefully thinking about what your supervisors and managers are doing in that period because the guys aren't quite on yet. Right, then they get in the flow of things and towards the end they're focused on going home. Perhaps they relax a bit more, they know it's nearly time to go. Incidents take a bit of a jump at that period. But not a great deal of difference here, not statistically different enough for us to say that they're adapting. It doesn't appear that they adapt over the 28-day cycle. This is the subjective, so this is them saying how tired they are and all that shows an upward curve. This is quite a small difference. So their sleepiness and their subjective fatigue based on surveys, it's actually, the estimates are similar there as you can see and there's not a great deal of difference. This scale is quite wide over here so it looks like it's swinging up but it's quite a small increase. So again, they don't think they're getting more fatigued over the course of the cycle but they're saying, 80% of them are saying there's too much fatigue on the project. So these are the ones that are preliminary, as I said. They still need to be cleansed and checked by professionals outside of our company, but we don't expect they're going to change significantly. This is the cognitive findings over the day of cycle. Now remember, these are average. There'll be much more granular information in the final report, but this is based on reaction time testing. So Siobhan talked about this yesterday. I think another couple of speakers have also referred to it. So it's testing basically their cognitive performance. And that's when the incidents occur, is when people get tired enough that their cognitive performance starts to decrease or they get cognitive impairment. So this is what it looks like over the cycle. It has spikes obviously and we need to pull all that apart and have a look at it. But couldn't show you all that data today, but that's what it looks like. Interestingly, this is what the lapses look like. So here going down is worse, here going up is worse. So this means towards the end of the cycle they're having more and more lapses or periods where they can't quite get it right, which is more risky around microsleeps and those sorts of things. It changes their behaviour. So more lapses. I think Siobhan was also referring to this in terms of the lab work they've done. Again, other experts in this field done a lot of work in controlled situations. Obviously we're in the field, we were out there with them. You can't control it to the same level you would in a lab. But based on their results over 7 full cycles, their lapses are increasing. This is the one that's really interesting and relates a bit to the article that Tim quoted this morning. Over the cycle, we're getting up to a 20% reduction in their cognitive performance. That's equivalent, once you get about a 10% reduction, it's equivalent to about 0.05 alcohol level, blood alcohol level. Once you get to 20%, it's about equivalent to 1.1. So it just gives you a bit of a feel for what's actually happening. And towards the end of the cycle, it's obviously dipping quite well below the 80% mark. There is a spike again at the end of the cycle. We're still investigating what's causing that, making sure it's not our data, and what behavioural observations are we making at that point. But it clearly doesn't get back up, and there is very limited adaptation. It actually looks like it just continues to get worse over the length of the roster. So what does that mean? A large proportion of participants do have key risk factors for fatigue and sleeping disorders. They're overweight, they're not fit, they don't exercise, they smoke, they drink too much. Who has wet camps? A couple of you. Anyone run a dry camp or made that decision? We have zero tolerance for alcohol in the workplace clearly these days, and there's lots of compulsory alcohol testing and all of those things. This was a wet camp, as are most of them. And although we would say it doesn't actually matter whether it's wet or dry, there's enough bootleg alcohol in the camps for it to be a problem. So unless you're going to search everyone's bag as they walk in the door or onto roster, it's potentially an issue for you. Despite rigorous testing and assurances from the company that all was well in relation to alcohol, our anecdotal evidence and being on site as an uninvolved third-party observer is that their guys can avoid testing and they go out of their way to do so, and there's quite a high level of alcohol consumption on site. Generally, we like to think it's not happening, but our evidence would suggest that it is. Every industry is different, of course. Some of you might test 100%, some mine sites certainly do, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Sleep obtained is similar to other like industries in terms of this project, but excessive fatigue does appear to be a problem. The risks are high. How are you going to ALARP the risks? And that's what we need to get to. So people talked about some different strategies before when I asked you to think about it. More resources came up quite commonly. Other things that you need to think about in terms of ALARPing the risk. I'm going to go straight to this one because it's kind of, I guess, a setup of where we'd say you're going to get the most bang for your buck. It was ingrained in what Tim was talking about in terms of his company, and it's taking a cultural-based approach to getting behavioural or individual change and commitment. So you'll be all familiar with safety management systems, and now we're talking fatigue risk management systems. Some industries have been for some time, some industries are quite new to it. How do we embed the FRMS within your safety management system? Fatigue is a hazard. It's not about the cycle length. It is, of course, the longer they work, the tireder they get. That would be logical. The longer their days are, the tired they are at the end of them. But at the end of the day, we're not showing adaptation or any magic cure in terms of length of roster cycle. If it kicks in about the eighth day, most of you are working rosters where there's fatigue. So it is about making or helping people make the right choices about their fatigue and then what they do once they're fatigued. And the only thing that's really going to change that is a really good balance between having the right process and compliance and the right systems in place, but with the right non-rational or behavioural elements that cause the guys to make or the girls to make different decisions about what they do day to day, i.e. not getting in the car and driving home. In our safety training that we do with organisations, there's a video, you may have seen it, and it interviews the family of a shift worker who was killed on the way home from his shift. He had a micro sleep. It was a single vehicle accident. There was no other reason that could be attributed other than fatigue. He basically fell asleep at the wheel. And the video interviews the family, so the kids and the wife, and we play that to the guys, and there's an immediate emotional response to what's going on, and that's part of the education and awareness. It's not training per se. Education and awareness are different. They should be treated differently, and so it's worth thinking about what you're doing in that context. So what's culture? The challenges for construction industries that we see, and certainly our clients in particular in pipelines, it's a transient workforce, you have regular turnover of staff, there's a large unengaged workforce. So we would say to you that typically in the field, our experience is they're not disengaged, but they are unengaged. What we haven't done is taken what we know about teams, performance, the way organisations work, and they're an organisation, they just happen to be in high-vis vests out in the field, and transferred that to the field. We haven't done that well yet, at least in the industries we work in anyway. So they need to be engaged. We need to look at their concerns, procedures, inductions that occur and when. How is their family situation impacted? What are the social isolation impacts? Those sorts of things. Team dynamics and human factors, and moving away from perhaps more traditional ways of working. Leadership, behaviours and values, induction, performance management, sharing knowledge, and we would say the most important thing, generating pride in your workforce about the results. Can you just have a chat to the person next to you, because you're all getting a bit sleepy now and you need a coffee? Have a chat to the person next to you. What do you think would generate pride in the results? What would cause a workforce to work together differently and to actually be focused on the results that companies can get, or the safety results or the fatigue results? What things would cause them to want to be proud of those results? What are the things that matter? Can you have a chat about that? Why would people change their individual behaviour? Okay, let's get a couple of responses. So what would cause people to want to be proud of results, or get them feeling that they're proud of the results, or influence their individual choices? What sort of things? Could people just shout some out? Recognition. Okay, so being recognised and rewarded. Until we get to the point where a company is happy that someone has cost money, but it could have been a significant safety issue if they hadn't done what they did, then we're not really getting the espoused value to meet the behaviour. So an example is if there's a shutdown, someone shuts down a site because they perceive there was a safety issue at hand. It costs $1 million to do that, let's say, and that person is not openly rewarded for that or recognised for that, then the assumption is, oh, it wasn't okay to do that. So really, safety is kind of important around here, but money talks. Commercial interests are higher, more prominent than the safety shutdown. So when we're rewarding people, even when they cost us money, if it's safety related, then you start to get the right messages into your workforce. Okay, some others? Being an industry leader. So being, and it sounds to me like busy industries are right in this space. How do you create an identity or a connection to the company in a way that says we want to maintain our position as an industry leader? Yep, great one. Some others? Storytelling is incredibly powerful. It's a bit like the story with the gentleman who died on his way home from work. Those sorts of stories start to mesh teams in a way that increases or changes their choices. So influencing behaviour, I do need to wrap up shortly, so I'll do a couple of these fairly quickly. What interests my boss fascinates me. Great quote. Think about that. You're in a supervisory management position. What interests you fascinates them. What you pay attention to, what you measure, is what you get. So those are the sorts of things where we need to think a little bit differently about our leadership, management and supervisory approach in the field. It's not just about individual choice or procedure. It has to be about behavioural change. I'll only touch on a couple of these. There'll be copies of the presentation afterwards. There's also a paper outside with us if you'd like to pick one up that is the detail behind what I'm talking about here, particularly in terms of the study. The most important thing we would say, if I covered nothing else on this slide, I would say the most important thing is to be creating group norms or cultural norms in your organisation where people want to do the right thing. Systems will get us so far. They're important, we need to have them, but they are equally important to behavioural influence. People have to want to do the right thing, to stop themselves or to not get in that car or to sleep overnight before they head home. They have to want to do that, and one of the things you can do to influence that is create a mates-based culture or a team-based culture, which we're very good at in urban settings and in offices, but we're not so good at in the field. Defence does it incredibly well. Might be a more extreme version of what we're talking about, but the principles are similar. How do you create a team-based culture in the field where it's more important to look out for your mate, he'll look out for you, and the group norm starts to change the way we think about safety and fatigue. There are case studies we've just talked about. Use real-life case studies. Upskill people on how to assess fatigue. Tim was talking about that. What are the things your employees need to know in order to recognise fatigue? We found consistently in several projects we're on that are field-based, supervisors vaguely understand fatigue, but they don't know how to identify it. Lead, not lag indicators, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, but indicators that measure the right things, not what we're not doing. How do we use lead indicators much more effectively, a strengths-based approach, if you like, to making sure that we can influence behaviour. We would even say your org design, your roles and responsibilities, the accountabilities that go along with fatigue. Again, other companies have done a lot of work in that space. Safety messages. People fail to notice after a very short period of time. If you don't refresh your messages on a regular basis, refresh what's going on, they're going to lose it. Increase individual awareness, whole range of issues there. Other speakers have talked about them. What do you need to be thinking about in terms of training and awareness? Organisational awareness, though, is one of the key. We find there's a very different perception of what's going on in head office as opposed to what actually happens on the ground. Training, considering it an actual hazard, clearer reporting systems. So we're not saying systems aren't important, they are, but where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck is changing behaviour. Actually getting people to be proud of doing the right thing or wanting to do it so that there's mutual benefit for the company and for the team. Don't be spooked, be sensible, but it is about generational change and getting people to change the way they think about their fatigue, and there's a range of things there you can do. Some suggestions, there'll be many more, as some other speakers have said, we'll be on this journey for a long time. We wanted to give you a snapshot of the data so that you had a feel for what was actually happening in the field. There's not many studies that we can find anyway that have done that. Certainly none for the pipeline industry across the world, but there's not many in other industries. Mining's very good, but it was all night shift based and our clients don't do night shift, so we wanted to have a look at it. So the results are there. You're welcome to take a paper. There's some ideas there about that. I'll leave that slide up there for people to have a bit of a look at while I take any questions if there's any.